So in this video, we're going to talk about an arrangement workflow that I call the diversion approach to arrangement. Now this is the third video in this series on arrangement, so if you haven't already seen the first two, go check them out first before watching this one. Otherwise, let's dive right into it. So the diversion approach is when the B section takes the track somewhere completely new. Instead of reframing the core idea established in the A section, like the previous two techniques that we looked at did, you'll introduce a brand new idea in that B section that shifts the narrative of the track. This technique is the most exciting technique because instead of following the typical pattern of repetition and variation, the listener is taken somewhere completely new. The key with the diversion approach is to create a shift that's unexpected, but also welcomed. It's easy to create a sharp contrast that really just throws the listener off. So when you're applying this technique, focus on the idea of creating an unexpected but welcomed transition. So when should you use this approach compared to the other two that we've looked at? The diversion approach works well when you have a pretty good A section but want to take the track somewhere completely new. You already know what this technique sounds like. The drop or chorus comes completely out of nowhere, taking you by surprise, but the transition is still very smooth and exciting. While this approach is great, it's definitely not for every track. Personally, I like to use it when I have a good idea in my A section, but I have a feeling that I want to take it somewhere new. If I've got an A section that I'm really excited about, I'll probably use one of the first two techniques so that I can build off of that idea that I really enjoy. So let's take a look at this technique in action, then discuss a few practical strategies to apply this to your own productions. So we're back in the remix that we've looked at so far in this course, and now we're going to be checking out the second chorus, where I've created this chorus using the diversion approach to arrangement. I've got the same pre-chorus as we've looked at so far in the previous two videos that moves into a new chorus. So let's just listen to that transition, and then we'll talk about what's going on, how I wrote this, and what makes it work. So I'm not totally stoked on the production for this chorus, but you get the essential idea of what I was going for. The main thing that I want you to focus on for this chorus is how it really just shifts the energy and tone from what was established in this verse and pre-chorus. The verse and pre-chorus are very bright, poppy, and uplifting. On the other hand, this chorus shifts the narrative of the track. It takes it down to more of like a dark, gloomy tone. And the way that I did that was by introducing a new chord progression by establishing a new harmonic foundation. Let's listen to that transition again, and then we'll talk about the techniques that I was using to create this variation. Let's stop. So the main idea behind the diversion approach is to introduce a new chord progression in your B section. Introducing a new chord progression will by itself shift the emotion of that track. The chord progression that I'm using in the pre-chorus is the same as the other two that we've looked at in this track. Let's just listen to it again to root ourselves with it. So this chord progression by itself is pretty bright and happy. It is actually pretty similar to the most stereotypical 4-chord pop song. It's more or less just a rearrangement of those chords. We've got 4, 1, into the 6, into the 5. So 3 major chords, just 1 minor chord, definitely has a brighter, happier tone. Let's take a look at the main chord progression that I used in this chorus, and let's take a look at that with the main pluck layer that I have. Let's take a listen to it by itself. So let's talk about what's going on in this chord progression and how it relates back to the chord progression that was established in the A section. This is a question that I'll get a lot from people where they want to be able to use this type of approach, this diversion approach, and create a new chord progression in the next section, but they don't know how to do it in a way that makes sense. They don't know how to make that transition feel smooth and natural. We're going to talk about specific strategies about that later, but let's look at how I did that exactly with this progression. So I'm playing this progression with more of an open voicing. As you can see, I've got a big space between these notes, but to simplify it, I'm just going to drop the top note in each of these chords down an octave. Doing that will give me all of these chords in their root voicing. So the progression starts out on F sharp minor. So earlier, the progression started on D major, but I'm using a different first chord, which is going to be this F sharp minor. Because it is also a minor chord, it'll give a different flavor than the major chord that they started on in the verse and pre-chorus progression. So right away, when this chord progression hits, the listener knows that they're going somewhere new. And that's a great way to be able to create that distinction with your B section using the diversion approach or really any other approach. Starting on a new chord is going to be the easiest way to create a new progression that grabs the listener's attention, telling them that they're somewhere new. So starts out on F sharp minor. From there, I go to A major, and I'm actually going to pop up the A major scale on the top right so you know what we're working with. And I'm also going to pop up the chord progression that was used in the verse just so you can see what came before this progression. And as you'll see, the second chord in the verse progression was also an A major, so this creates an element of similarity. Previously, I went from D to A, but here I'm going from F sharp minor to A. So this creates an element of variation because we've got a different first chord, as well as an element of repetition since this A major chord gets repeated. Let's look at the third chord. So the third chord is going to be C sharp, E, and G sharp, which will make it a C sharp minor chord. So far in this track, we haven't seen any type of C sharp minor chord, so this is going to grab the listener's attention. We already saw an F sharp minor somewhere else, and we had that A major chord, but the C sharp minor is really going to stick out of the mix because the listener hasn't heard it yet. And then it is going to end on the same chord as earlier, which is an E major chord. So two chords are different and two chords are the same. The first and third are different, and then the second and fourth are the same. Because we've seen a couple of these chords before, it'll have that element of familiarity, but since there are two new chords, it has that necessary element of repetition. And again, because the first chord was changed, this will really immediately tell the listener that a change has occurred. Let's listen to that transition strictly using the main two instruments, just ignoring the production for now. So when this chord initially hits, it kind of sticks out as a little bit nasty because we're expecting that same exact chord from earlier because listeners are so trained to want and expect repetition. While I did create a lot of tension with that F sharp minor chord, I resolved that tension by going back to the one chord, really just creating a balance between that tension and release. So just another technique that I used here. Outside of using a new chord progression, there are other changes that I made to make this chorus feel distinct and full, but those are going to be more production things that I would rather not talk about right now. Obviously, there are so many intricacies to the different genres that it's hard to speak broadly about it, but again, stripping things down to just the harmonic foundation is a great way to get out of whatever loop you're working in to be able to develop new sections. I had a chord progression in my verse right here that I liked, but felt the need to go somewhere new. So in my chorus, I wrote a new chord progression starting on a new chord, again, just sticking within the key that I was working with, not trying to overcomplicate it. And then I developed around that to create a full and interesting section. So now that we've looked at an example of this technique in action, let's talk about some practical strategies in order to apply the diversion approach to arrangement. So as I've talked about, the main way that you will apply the diversion approach to arrangement is to create a new chord progression in your B section that contrasts what you have in your A section. So to help you get started with this, let's look at some tips on how to effectively change chord progressions in a song, since that is the foundation for what this arrangement workflow is going to be. So the first tip is a pretty obvious one, and that's going to be to make sure that both progressions sound good by themselves. If you're trying to change chord progressions, both of them have to stand on their own if they have any shot of working well together. So first tip, make sure if you're writing a new progression that you're happy with how that is by itself before you start worrying about how the transition between the two is going to sound. Second, make sure that there is a purposeful distinction between the two chord progressions. Consider both the quality of the chords you're using as well as the emotional tone of each progression. From an emotional level, you can use your B section to shift the tone of a track. For example, if your A section chord progression is moody and emotional, your B section chord progression could be bright and uplifting. I did the opposite of this in the track that I just showed you, where I had a happier, brighter chord progression in the verse, and then I contrasted that with a darker, moodier chord progression in my chorus. From a theory level, this is achieved by the chords that you are using. At the simplest level, if you want to create distinction, you can use different chords in your B section. You can reuse one or two of the chords, but the overall progression should feel distinct and stand on its own. So the third technique is to start a third away from the first chord that is used in your A section progression. This is a great way to be able to create a smooth transition between those two progressions. So what do I mean by this? Well, for example, if your A section progression starts on the 1 chord, you can start your B section progression on either the 3 or the 6. The 3 is going to be a third above the 1, and the 6 is going to be a third below. If this doesn't make any sense, let me pop up the A major scale on the screen and explain this to you. So what I mean by a third is that is going to be the chord that is either a major third or a minor third above whatever that note that you're starting on. So let's say that we had a chord progression in the A section that started on A major and we wanted to change progressions. Well, we could use a chord progression in the B section that starts a third away. And a third is simply going to be a note that is 2 adjacent notes in the scale. So if we start on A, we can count up 2 notes in the scale and we can get C sharp minor. So if we started on C sharp minor, that is going to be an effective way to make that transition feel familiar. This relates back to the idea of common tones, and this is something that I've talked about a bit, that there's definitely a lot of great material online, but because those two chords have a few of the same notes, they'll sound similar and have a similar function, so that transition is going to work well. You can also go down a third. Previously, I went up a third. You can go down a third, so down a third from A would be the 6, which is going to be F sharp, and that chord in the key of A major is F sharp minor. And that's actually the technique that I used in the track that I just showed you. Part of why that transition was unexpected, but also welcomed, was because I used that technique. If you're still confused on this idea, I talk about this in a few different track breakdowns that I have. In both the Flume and Lose the Child track breakdowns that I have, I talk about how they both use this. You can check out those articles using the link on the screen, but otherwise, that is going to be more or less it for this technique. Again, the key with the diversion approach is trial and error. The idea is to start with a blank slate in your B section and challenge yourself to write a chord progression that works well on its own and also works well in context. As I've mentioned, starting on a chord different than the first chord in your A section progression is a great starting point, and then you can leverage your songwriting knowledge to create a full and exciting progression. So that is going to be it for all these videos. I hope you were able to gain some valuable insight into the songwriting and arrangement process. Again, if you're trying to create a B section, you're more or less stuck to one of these 3 approaches, so if you have no idea where to go, you can use any of these techniques. I'll be combining all of the information from this and the previous videos into a massive blog post. I'll be publishing this post about a week or 2 after this video goes live, so once it is live, I'm going to post that link in the description so you can check it out, really make sure that you understand these techniques, and also get some additional advice and guidance on how to implement these into your songwriting workflow. For real, let me know if you have any questions on this or the previous videos. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next one.